At my grandson's birthday party, I realized there wasn't a seat for me, and my daughter-in-law just smiled and said, "Oh, we didn't think you'd stay long." I remember standing there with the wrapped gift still in my hands, the bright paper crinkling softly under my fingers as if even it felt out of place. The backyard was decorated in blue and silver balloons, a long folding table set neatly under a white canopy, plates arranged, names written in careful cursive on small cards. I looked for mine once, then again, slower this time, tracing each name as if I might have missed it the first time. Daniel. Ashley. Ethan. Even neighbors I barely knew had a seat. But not me. I let out a small breath, the kind that disappears before anyone notices, and adjusted my cardigan as if the afternoon breeze had made me cold. Ashley's voice was light, almost playful, the kind people use when they don't want to sound cruel. "There's plenty of room to stand," she added, already turning away before I could respond. I nodded anyway, though she wasn't looking. I told myself it was nothing. A small oversight. These things happen at busy parties. Children ran past me, their laughter loud and careless, frosting already smeared on their cheeks though the cake hadn't even been cut yet. I stepped aside to let a group of parents pass, their arms full of brightly wrapped boxes, and found myself near the edge of the yard, just close enough to see everything, just far enough to not be part of it. I placed Ethan's gift carefully on the table, making sure it didn't block anyone else's view, and smoothed the corner of the wrapping paper where it had bent. No one noticed. Not Daniel, who was busy flipping burgers on the grill, laughing too loudly at something Ashley said. Not Ashley, who moved from guest to guest with easy confidence, her hand resting lightly on people's shoulders, guiding them to their seats. I watched as she picked up a spare chair from the side and offered it to one of her friends who had just arrived. "We'll make space," she said warmly, pulling it up to the table without hesitation. I looked at the empty spot where that chair had been leaning before. That could have been mine. For a moment, I thought about asking. It would have been simple. Just a quiet question, a polite smile. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way Ashley hadn't even looked surprised when I mentioned the missing seat. Maybe it was the certainty in her voice, as if this had been decided long before I arrived. I folded my hands together and stayed where I was, feeling the weight of the afternoon settle slowly around me. From across the yard, I heard Ethan call out, "Grandma," and my heart lifted just enough to hurt. He waved, his small hand sticky with juice, his smile wide and genuine. I waved back, smiling in a way that felt practiced, controlled. For him, I could pretend. For him, I could stand a little longer. But as I looked back at the table, at the neat line of chairs that didn't include me, a quiet thought settled in, colder than the breeze. This wasn't a mistake. And somehow, that hurt more than anything Ashley could have said out loud. I stayed near the edge of the yard long after the music grew louder and the conversations blended into a soft, constant hum. It was strange how easy it was to disappear in a place that was supposed to feel like home. I picked up a plastic cup from the drink table, filled it halfway with lemonade, and held it more for something to do than because I was thirsty. The ice clinked softly each time I shifted my grip, a small sound that reminded me I was still standing there, still part of the scene even if no one seemed to notice. Across the yard, Daniel laughed again, louder this time, his voice carrying over the chatter. I watched him for a moment, trying to find something familiar in his expression, something that belonged to the boy who used to run to me after school with scraped knees and stories that tumbled out faster than I could follow. But he did not look in my direction. Not once. Ashley moved beside him, adjusting the plates, straightening napkins that did not need straightening, her smile effortless as she leaned into conversations. She looked comfortable, in control, like everything was exactly as she had planned. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other and noticed how the grass beneath my shoes had begun to flatten, a small patch worn down from standing in the same place too long. No one had asked if I needed anything. No one had said, "Please, sit." It was not loud or obvious. It was quiet, subtle. But it was there, in the spaces between words, in the way people glanced past me instead of at me. A woman I recognized from the neighborhood walked by and gave me a polite smile, the kind you offer a stranger at the grocery store. "Are you with the family?" she asked kindly. For a second, I did not know how to answer. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, the words catching somewhere in my chest. "Yes," I said finally, my voice steady enough to pass. "I am his grandmother." She nodded, as if that explained everything, and continued on without another question. I watched her take a seat at the table, pulling her chair closer as someone beside her made room. The space adjusted for her without hesitation. It always seemed to adjust for everyone else. I took a slow breath and looked back at the line of chairs, counting them again without meaning to. Every place was filled now. Every name accounted for. It would have been so easy to add one more. Just one. I lowered my gaze to the cup in my hand and realized the ice had already melted, the lemonade watered down and warm. I had not taken a single sip. Somewhere behind me, a camera clicked, capturing another moment I was not part of. I turned slightly and saw Ashley gathering people together for a group photo, her voice bright and practiced. "Family first," she called out, gesturing them closer. Daniel stepped beside her, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder as they all leaned in. I stood where I was, just outside the frame, watching them arrange themselves into something that looked perfect from a distance. For a brief second, I wondered if anyone would notice I was missing. No one did. And as the camera flashed, freezing their smiles into something permanent, I felt that quiet certainty settle deeper inside me. This was not new. This was simply the first time I had stopped making excuses for it. The applause faded into the background as people returned to their seats, their conversations picking up exactly where they had left off, as if nothing had been missing at all. I remained where I was for a moment longer, then slowly moved toward the far end of the table, not to sit, but to place Ethan's gift more neatly among the others. It was a small thing, adjusting the ribbon, straightening the tag, but it gave my hands purpose. As I did, I noticed something I had missed before. A clipboard rested near the cake, partially tucked beneath a stack of paper plates. It held a printed list, names typed in clean rows with checkmarks beside most of them. I glanced around out of habit, though no one was paying attention to me, and then I looked down at the list more carefully. Daniel Collins. Check. Ashley Collins. Check. Ethan Collins. Check. Friends, neighbors, even a few distant relatives I had not seen in years. Every name accounted for, each one marked with a neat, deliberate tick. I let my eyes move slowly from top to bottom, then back again, as if reading it twice might somehow change what I saw. My name was not there. Not crossed out. Not misspelled. Simply not included. For a moment, everything else seemed to quiet around me. The laughter, the music, the clatter of plates all softened into something distant, like a sound coming from another room. I reached out and touched the edge of the paper, just lightly, enough to confirm it was real. This was not a last-minute mistake. It had been organized, planned, printed. I straightened up, my fingers lingering for a second before I pulled my hand away. Behind me, I heard Ashley's voice again, closer this time, speaking to a group of women gathered near the drinks table. "We had to keep it small this year," she said, her tone casual, almost apologetic, but not quite. "Just immediate family and close friends. You know how it is." There was a soft murmur of agreement, the kind people offer when they do not really question what they are hearing. Someone laughed lightly. "Smart choice," another voice replied. "These things can get out of hand." I did not turn around. I did not need to. I understood exactly what she meant by small. I understood who counted as immediate, and who did not. The realization did not come like a sudden shock. It settled slowly, firmly, like something that had been waiting for me to notice it all along. I stepped back from the table and picked up my cup again, though the lemonade inside was now warm and flat. My hands were steady, surprisingly so. I took a small sip, more out of habit than anything else, and set it down beside the stack of napkins. Across the yard, Daniel called out something about lighting the candles, his voice cheerful, unaware or unwilling to be aware of anything beyond the moment in front of him. I watched as Ashley handed him a lighter, their fingers brushing briefly, both of them smiling as if everything was exactly as it should be. For a brief second, I wondered if he had seen the list. If he had noticed the empty space where my name should have been. But then I let that thought go. It did not matter anymore whether he knew. What mattered was that I did. I folded my hands together once more, feeling the quiet shift inside me, something subtle but undeniable. This was not about a chair. It was not even about a party. It was about being erased so carefully that it could still be called polite. And standing there, just outside the circle of light and laughter, I realized this was not the first time it had happened. It was simply the first time I had allowed myself to see it clearly. The candles were lit one by one, thin flames flickering in the soft afternoon light, and everyone gathered closer as Ethan leaned forward, his small hands gripping the edge of the table with excitement. I stayed where I was, just outside the circle, watching the glow reflect in his eyes as he took a deep breath and made his wish. For a moment, the world narrowed down to that single image, a child surrounded by people who loved him, laughter rising again as he blew out the candles in one quick breath. Applause followed, warm and immediate, filling the space so completely that there was no room left for anything else. I clapped too, quietly, my hands meeting just enough to make a sound that disappeared into the rest. Ashley stepped forward first, placing a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder as she leaned in for a quick hug, her voice soft but clear as she told him how proud she was. Daniel followed, ruffling his hair, smiling in a way that looked easy, practiced, as if this moment had been rehearsed in his mind long before it happened. I watched them both, noticing how naturally they moved together, how seamlessly they filled the roles they had chosen. There was no hesitation. No uncertainty. Everything about it felt settled, decided. Plates were passed around, slices of cake carefully served, the frosting thick and bright against the white paper plates. I saw Ashley handing them out, making sure each person received one, her movements efficient, controlled. When she reached the end of the table, she paused, counted briefly, then turned back without looking in my direction. No plate was set aside. No second thought was given. I did not feel surprised. Not anymore. I stepped back further, letting a group of children rush past me toward the gift table, their voices loud and overlapping as they tried to guess what was inside each box. Someone brushed against my arm without noticing, their attention fixed entirely on the excitement in front of them. I adjusted my sleeve and stood still again, the fabric of my cardigan soft against my skin, a small comfort in a space that no longer felt like it belonged to me. Across the yard, I noticed a stack of folded chairs leaning against the fence, untouched, unused. For a brief second, I considered walking over, unfolding one, and placing it at the edge of the table. It would have been simple. No one would have stopped me. But I did not move. Something about that action felt like asking for permission in a place where permission had already been quietly denied. Instead, I remained where I was, watching as the party continued without interruption, as if my absence from it had already been accounted for. The sun shifted slightly overhead, casting longer shadows across the grass, and I realized how much time had passed without anyone noticing that I had not sat down, had not eaten, had not been included in even the smallest way. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was careful. Intentional. And as I stood there, listening to the steady rhythm of voices and laughter that did not reach me, I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not about forgetting. This was about deciding who mattered, and who did not. And for the first time, I stopped trying to place myself back into a space that had already been closed to me. The noise of the party softened around me as I stepped a little farther back, closer to the fence where the grass gave way to a narrow strip of concrete. It was quieter there, not silent, but distant enough that the laughter felt like something I was only overhearing, not part of. I folded my hands in front of me again, a habit I had carried for years, something to keep still when everything else felt uncertain. From this angle, I could see the entire table clearly, the way the chairs curved around it, the way people leaned in toward each other as they spoke, their bodies forming a closed circle without realizing it. There was no gap left. No space waiting to be filled. I noticed how Ashley moved through it all with ease, bending slightly to speak to one person, then another, her voice always light, always pleasant. At one point, she reached for a serving tray and handed it to Daniel, their exchange quick and quiet, practiced in a way that suggested they no longer needed to say much to understand each other. I watched them for a moment, then let my gaze drift beyond them, to the house itself. The back door stood open, the curtains inside shifting gently with the breeze. For a second, I imagined walking inside, away from the noise, into the familiar quiet of the kitchen. I could picture it clearly. The counter where I used to set down groceries. The cabinet where I kept the extra plates. Small details that had once belonged to me without question. But even that image felt different now, like something remembered rather than something I could return to. I stayed where I was. A voice beside me broke the stillness. "You have been standing here the whole time." I turned slightly and saw Linda, a neighbor I had known for years, her expression not curious, but observant. She was holding a paper plate with a slice of cake, untouched. I offered a small smile. "It is a nice day," I said, the words. Simple, safe. She looked past me toward the table, then back at me again, her eyes lingering for just a moment longer than most people allowed. "Did you get a seat?" she asked quietly. The question was gentle, but it landed with more weight than anything that had been said all afternoon. I shook my head once, just enough to answer without turning it into something larger. Linda followed my gaze to the line of chairs, then to the clipboard still resting near the cake. She did not say anything right away. Instead, she stepped a little closer, lowering her voice. "That list has been on the counter inside since yesterday," she said. "I saw Ashley checking it twice this morning." I felt something settle inside me at her words, not sharp, not sudden, but steady. "Confirmed." I nodded slowly, my eyes returning to the table where everything continued as if nothing had changed. "I see," I said, my voice even. Linda hesitated, as if deciding whether to say more, then simply placed the untouched plate of cake on the small ledge beside the fence. "You should eat something," she added softly, before stepping away to rejoin the others. I looked down at the plate she had left behind, the frosting bright, untouched, perfect in a way that felt almost deliberate. For a moment, I considered picking it up, taking a bite, pretending that this small gesture could fill the space that had been left empty. But I did not reach for it. Instead, I let my gaze move once more across the yard, over the chairs, the table, the people who had arranged themselves into something complete without me. And standing there, with the afternoon light beginning to shift and stretch across the ground, I realized that this was no longer about being included in a moment. It was about understanding my place in the pattern they had created. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to step back into it. I stood there a little longer after Linda walked away, my eyes resting on the untouched slice of cake she had left behind, the frosting beginning to soften under the afternoon sun. Around me, the party carried on in its easy rhythm, voices rising and falling, chairs scraping lightly against the ground as people shifted closer to one another. Nothing had changed. And yet, something inside me had. I reached into my handbag slowly, almost absent-mindedly, and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with a soft glow, reflecting faintly in the sunlight. I had not planned to use it, but my fingers moved with a quiet certainty, as if they already knew where to go. I opened my messages first, scrolling briefly through familiar names, then paused. There were conversations I had not revisited in months. Messages from Daniel that had grown shorter over time. Responses that had become delayed, then infrequent, then almost non-existent unless I reached out first. I did not linger there. Instead, I opened my email. The inbox was neat, organized, just the way I liked it. I tapped on a folder I had not opened since last winter. The subject lines were still there, unchanged, each one carrying a piece of a conversation that had once felt routine. Documents. Confirmations. Attachments. Things I had signed, reviewed, approved without much thought because at the time, there had been no reason to question them. I opened one of the files, letting it load slowly. The numbers appeared first, followed by the names. My name. Daniel's name. A few others. Structured, formal, written in a language that was meant to be clear, but often hid more than it revealed. I did not need to read every line again. I remembered enough. I remembered the day it had been presented to me, the way Ashley had explained it so smoothly, her voice calm, reassuring. "It is just easier this way," she had said, placing the papers in front of me with a pen already uncapped. "Everything stays within the family." I had believed her then. Not because I did not understand what I was signing, but because I had not imagined a reason to doubt her intentions. I closed the file and lowered the phone slightly, my fingers still resting against the screen. Across the yard, Ashley laughed again, her voice bright, carrying easily through the air. I looked up and watched her for a moment, noticing the way she glanced briefly toward the table, then toward the house, as if mentally checking that everything was in place. Organized. Controlled. I slipped my phone back into my bag without rushing, the movement quiet, deliberate. The pieces were not falling into place all at once. They had been there for a long time. I was simply seeing them now, one by one, without the comfort of excuses to soften them. I took a slow breath and stepped away from the fence, not toward the table, but slightly to the side, where I could see both the yard and the open door of the house at the same time. The distance gave me a clearer view, a fuller picture. And standing there, with the noise of the party continuing behind me, I understood something that felt both simple and final. I had not been forgotten. I had been accounted for. Carefully. Intentionally. And whatever came next would not be decided in moments like this, in crowded backyards or under polite smiles. It would be decided quietly, the same way all of this had been arranged. Without noise. Without warning. Without asking for permission. The afternoon began to thin out slowly, the kind of quiet shift that happens when people start checking the time without making it obvious. A few guests gathered their things, offering light thanks and casual goodbyes, their voices still warm, still polite. I watched as Ashley walked them toward the gate, her hand resting briefly on each shoulder, her smile steady, practiced. She thanked them for coming, for celebrating, for being part of the day. The words came easily to her. They always had. I remained where I was, no longer trying to find a place closer, no longer measuring the distance between myself and the table. That distance had already been decided. Instead, I let my eyes move across the yard one more time, taking in the details I had overlooked before. The decorations that had been carefully chosen. The arrangement of chairs that left no gaps. The list on the table that had guided it all. Nothing here was accidental. It was structured. Intentional. I noticed Daniel again, standing near the grill, speaking to someone with a relaxed posture that suggested he was exactly where he belonged. For a moment, I studied his face, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for any sign that he felt the absence I now understood so clearly. There was none. If he noticed, he did not show it. If he knew, he chose not to acknowledge it. I did not feel anger as I watched him. Not in the way I might have once expected. What I felt was quieter than that. Something steadier. The kind of clarity that leaves little room for emotion to move freely. I turned slightly and looked toward the house again, the open door still framing the familiar interior. The thought returned, not as a question this time, but as a realization. I no longer belonged inside that space. Not in the way I once had. That understanding did not break me. It settled into place, firm and undeniable. I reached down and picked up the small plate Linda had left behind. The cake was still untouched, the frosting smooth, the edges perfect. I held it for a moment, feeling its light weight in my hand, then set it back down exactly where it had been. Some things were not meant to be taken, even when they were offered. I adjusted the strap of my handbag on my shoulder and took a slow step back, then another, moving toward the edge of the yard where the gate stood slightly open. No one stopped me. No one called my name. The sounds of the party continued behind me, unchanged, uninterrupted. I paused just before reaching the gate and allowed myself one last look, not at any one person, but at the whole of it. The table. The chairs. The people arranged within them. It looked complete. Whole. As if nothing was missing at all. I nodded once, a small gesture meant only for myself, and stepped through the gate without drawing attention. The latch clicked softly behind me, a quiet sound that marked the end of something I had been holding on to longer than I realized. As I walked down the short path toward the sidewalk, the air felt different. Lighter, in a way that was difficult to explain. Not because anything had been fixed, but because something had finally been understood. And as I reached the curb and looked ahead, I knew that whatever came next would not begin with questions or confrontations. It would begin with decisions. Mine. The walk to my car felt longer than it should have, each step steady, measured, as if I was placing distance not just between myself and the house, but between who I had been and who I was beginning to become. The sound of the party faded behind me, replaced by the quiet hum of the street, a passing car in the distance, the soft rustle of leaves overhead. I reached for my keys without looking, unlocking the door with a small click that sounded louder than expected in the stillness. For a moment, I did not get in. I stood beside the car, my hand resting lightly on the handle, and let the silence settle fully around me. There were no voices here, no laughter, no carefully arranged spaces that I had to fit into or be excluded from. Just air, open and unclaimed. I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, placing my bag gently on the passenger side. My phone rested inside, quiet, unchanged. I did not reach for it right away. Instead, I sat there, looking straight ahead through the windshield, watching as the sunlight stretched across the pavement in thin, shifting lines. The image of the list returned to me, clear and precise. Names written neatly, checkmarks placed with intention. My absence recorded without ever being acknowledged. I reached into my bag then, retrieving my phone once more, and opened my contacts. There was a number I had not called in some time, not because it had been forgotten, but because there had never been a reason to use it. Until now. I tapped the screen and held the phone to my ear, listening to the steady ringing that followed. It did not take long for the call to be answered. A familiar voice greeted me, calm, professional, unchanged by time. I spoke simply, without explanation, without hesitation. I asked for an appointment. Soon. Not next week. Not when it was convenient. As soon as possible. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that comes when something unexpected has been requested, and then a time was offered. I accepted it without needing to check my schedule. I no longer had anything else that required adjustment. When the call ended, I lowered the phone slowly and placed it back in my bag. My hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers still, the cool surface grounding in a way that felt new. I did not feel rushed. I did not feel uncertain. What I felt was clarity, quiet and firm, settling into place piece by piece. I started the engine, the low sound filling the car, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. The house remained where it was, the party continuing behind its fence, unchanged by my absence. And that was the point. Nothing there needed to change for me to understand what had already been decided. As I drove down the street, the road stretching out ahead of me, I realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by moments like the one I had just left behind. It would be shaped by what I chose to do with what I now knew. Not loudly. Not suddenly. But carefully. Intentionally. The same way everything else had been done. The office was quiet when I walked in 2 days later, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, where every sound seemed softened by design. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and asked me to take a seat, her voice calm, professional, untouched by anything outside those walls. This was a different kind of space. No laughter. No carefully arranged chairs meant to exclude. Just order. Just clarity. I sat down and placed my handbag neatly on my lap, my hands resting over it as I looked around. Certificates lined the walls, framed and evenly spaced, each one a quiet reminder that decisions made here carried weight. Real weight. Not the kind that could be brushed aside with a smile or softened with polite words. When my name was called, I stood without hesitation and followed the assistant down a short hallway, my steps steady, measured. The office door opened, and I stepped inside. The man behind the desk stood to greet me, extending his hand with a familiarity that suggested he remembered me well, even if it had been some time. I shook his hand briefly and took the seat he offered, placing my bag beside me this time, not on my lap. He asked how I had been. I answered simply, "I have been well." There was no need to explain further. He nodded, then waited, giving me the space to speak first. I appreciated that. It told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation would go. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, then paused, deciding against it. Instead, I folded my hands together and looked at him directly. "I would like to review everything," I said, my voice even, clear. All documents. All accounts. Every name attached. He did not look surprised. Not in the way someone unfamiliar might have. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if this request fit into a pattern he understood well. Of course, he replied, turning slightly to retrieve a folder from his desk. As he opened it, the soft sound of paper shifting filled the room, steady and precise. He placed the documents in front of me, each page aligned carefully, each line written with a clarity that left little room for interpretation. I did not rush. I read slowly, deliberately, my eyes moving from one section to the next, taking in the details I had once accepted without question. Names. Percentages. Conditions. Everything structured, everything binding. I saw where decisions had been made. Where control had been assigned. Where trust had been assumed. And for the first time, I read it not as someone included, but as someone being positioned. When I finished, I placed the papers back on the desk, aligning them just as neatly as they had been given to me. I looked up and met his gaze again. I would like to make changes, I said. There was no hesitation in my voice. No uncertainty. Just a quiet certainty that settled into the space between us. He nodded once more, already reaching for a pen. Tell me what you would like to adjust. I did not look back at the documents. I did not need to. The decisions had already been made before I walked into that room. Everything, I said. The word was simple. Final. Outside, the world continued as it always had, unchanged by the conversation taking place behind that closed door. But inside, something shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to alter the balance that had been so carefully arranged without me. And as I began to speak, outlining each change with calm precision, I realized that this was where my place would be defined now. Not in a chair at a table. Not on a list someone else had written. But here. In choices that did not require permission.